Caribe Radio nos proponemos ser la emisora online calificada para ser la mejor opción en comunicación para usted. Nos preparamos en noticias, deportes, cultura, música y de entretenimiento general para que usted esté conectado todo el tiempo con nosotros. Caribe Radio ofrece el mejor servicio de comunicación digital para que las empresas se hagan visibles a diferentes públicos. Desde lo público trabajamos para el servicio y por el servicio social. Caribe Radio Online nos entrenamos día a día para brindar la mejor opción en producción de medios digitales. Caribe Radio, la radio del futuro.
Los conceptos, productos y servicios del siguiente espacio son responsabilidad del director del programa y no representan el pensamiento de esta emisora.
Good afternoon. This is Discussions with Authors, part of Books Over Drinks, a literary community dedicated to foster the passion for books and provide a platform for both authors and readers to exchange ideas and discuss their work. We are pleased to welcome Dr. Ben Burguis. Ben has a PhD in philosophy from the University of Miami. He hosts the podcast, Give Them an Argument. He's a columnist for Jacobin Magazine, and he's the author of 3 books, more recently one about the late Christopher Hitchens. This is a book that offers an insightful take on one of the most influential writers and provocateurs of our lifetime. Hitchens' inquisitive and assertive tone and his ability to articulate the most eloquent arguments in a quick-witted yet calculated manner would make you question any position contrary to his, later popularized in his infamous Hitch slaps. No topic was off limits, from his case against religion, to his cynical take on historical figures, to his thought-provoking pieces for Vanity Fair and Slate. However, this book is as much about Ben Burguis as it is about Hitchens, as he gives us his take on what he believes were some of the shortcomings in Hitchens' arguments, and as he covers some of the most consequential topics of our lifetime, from religion, politics, and morality. Ben, it is a pleasure to have you with us.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
So for anyone unfamiliar with Hitchens and his work, why don't we begin with the premise of the book? What makes Hitchens such an important and consequential figure? And why should we even care about what he had to say?
Sure. Well, one thing that I think makes him interesting is just that he did write and speak and engage in debates about such an interesting range of topics, that he's somebody who, you know, if you're interested in these debates about religion and atheism, certainly, you know, which is what took up a lot of his energy in the last years of his life, but also in international politics, American foreign policy, etc. Right? You know, socialism. You know, all of these things are things that he thought about and wrote about, and if you're interested in any of them, I think that he was one of the sort of consistently most interested in engaging people to read on these topics, you know, so I think it's a good point of departure. And, you know, the part of the title that's, you know, the least sort of explicitly spelled out in the book, you know, is the last part, you know, the why he still matters. But in some ways, I kind of see the whole book, you know, as the answer to that, since I think, you know, what I'm trying to do in the book is make a, you know, cumulative case that there are things to, you know, there are interesting things to be learned, both from what he got right and what he got wrong, and that, you know, and that he's worth seriously engaging with, which means, you know, sometimes agreeing with him and sometimes disagreeing with him.
So let's talk a bit about Hitchens' politics. His father served in the Royal Navy, so his military background meant a highly conservative upbringing. Yet he developed and kept left-leaning political views for most of his career, and his views sort of evolved over time, and towards the end of his life had more moderate views. Can you tell us a bit more about his politics and how they are in contrast to yours as well?
Yeah, so Hitchens, even though, as you say, his father was a conservative naval officer, you know, and he grew up, you know, upwardly mobile, kind of upper middle class family, going to private schools and then Oxford, but he became, around the time he went to Oxford, 1964, he became a pretty radical socialist. I mean, he'd already been in the Labour Party, and on the left wing of the Labour Party, the wing of it that was, most critical of the current Labour government's closeness to the United States, and it wanted to take a stronger stand against the Vietnam War. But then he joined a Trotskyist group called the International Socialists. And, I think the important thing to understand about them specifically is that these are people who are equally critical of Western capitalism and of, socialism, or what in their view passed for socialism in the Eastern Bloc. Their slogan was neither Washington nor Moscow, but international socialism. And when stuff was happening like 1968, when at the same time there's like a student uprising in Paris and a general strike that almost brings down the de Gaulle government of France, and simultaneously, more or less, there's the Prague Spring, it's an attempt by Czechoslovakian communist reformers to create a more humane and liberal version of that system, what Alexander Dubček called socialism with a human face, which was eventually crushed by Soviet tanks. And they could look at all of that and say, see, right, there's this sort of wave of international revolution against both of these things. And so Hitchens was very deeply involved in that until sometime in the 70s, when he drifts out of it, partly because of the sort of faction fights that groups like that are always having all the time, but also partly because I think he'd started to realize that 1968 wasn't the beginning of some wave of global revolutions, that if anything, whatever had been happening there was receding. And he starts working as a journalist. He rejoins the Labor Party, starts working as a journalist for the New Statesman, and then moves to the United States in the 80s. He's working for the Nation magazine primarily, although later also Vanity Fair, throughout the the 80s and 90s. And throughout this entire time, he's maybe a more moderate socialist than he was in 1968, but he is still he is still committed to all of the basic values that he always had been at that time. He his basic way of looking at the world was very similar to what it had been then. If you watch any of the debates that he did, you can still see on YouTube in the 80s and 90s. I go over some of them in the book. You can definitely see that. But then he starts to go through this big political shift in two ways, right? And I think one of the things that drove me toward wanting to write about Hitchens is that I felt like the kind of analysis that I was seeing elsewhere of why he politically shifted and what was going on there, I found very unconvincing. Because I think to really understand what was going on here, I think you have to see there are two kind of strands that he shifted on, right? One is about socialism, and one is on kind of the role of the U.S. military and American foreign policy, in interacting with the rest of the world.
Now, speaking about socialism, I've always thought that umbrella term had sort of like a bad PR problem. But I think the biggest problem with it is that misappropriation of misuse of the term that is really diluted its meaning. So I wanted to get your views on socialism. So let's say Bernie Sanders, the senator from Vermont, he calls himself a democratic socialism, and he speaks often about types of policies in places like Scandinavia. But while countries like Denmark and Sweden have social welfare programs and have socialized certain services like healthcare and education, and even consider themselves socialists, in the reality, for most of the part, they're capitalists, where 90% of the means of production are privately owned. Right. Now, Cuba, on the other hand, also consider themselves socialists, even though that they're run by the Communist Party, and it is a totalitarian regime, of course. So what the heck does socialism even mean anymore? And what do people like Bernie Sanders have to do with places like Scandinavia and regimes like Cuba? In principle, it looks like nothing, yet they're all fall within the same, or put under the same bucket.
Yeah, I mean, it's a pretty broad term. I mean, like in a way, it's a little bit like asking, it's a little bit like asking what, medieval Catholic inquisitors and and like student youth group pastors who, you know, spend all their time doing like interfaith dinners and say that they don't take the Bible literally have in common, right? Which is, you know, they spring from a common tradition, right? But that common tradition has a lot of different tendrils, and I think something is roughly similar in the case that you're given, right? So I think that, you know, socialism in the original sense means roughly that. I mean, there's absolutely nothing I could say about this that would be uncontroversial, right? I think there are people are, you know, going to disagree with any definition that I could give, but I think in the original sense, it means roughly that, you know, you object to the fact that under society as it exists right now, under capitalism, there's this division between a class of people who own, as you say, the means of production, by which we really mean, you know, production and distribution and exchange and all that stuff, right? And another class of people, the working class, who have to, you know, work for the first one to make a living. And there are, you know, there are many reasons that somebody would find that arrangement objectionable, but I mean, I think the two big ones are one, that, you know, it's a relationship of submission, you know, that the domination, you know, because you don't, you know, for 8 hours a day, and it's only 8 hours because of, you know, a long history of worker struggle, you know, taking it down from like 18 to, you know, to 6, 12 to, you know, 10 to 8, that, you know, but even at 8, right, for half of the hours you're awake every, you know, like most days of the week, you know, you have, you're in an environment that you don't really have any sort of, you know, collective democratic control over. So I think that's a big one. And I think another big one has to do with just the sort of, you know, human consequences, especially as markets tend to take over everything. And there are, you know, a lot of things, you know, the things that people desperately need to live their lives, they have to kind of rely on markets for. And I think that, you know, when you talk about Cuba, you know, that's like one instance of one sort of offshoot of that tradition, you know, which is the one that after World War I and the Russian Revolution is the one, you know, that tends to be known as communism, since originally socialism, communism, whatever, these are like roughly synonymous, you know, terms, or, you know, they or if they were being used to mean different things, you know, the authors sort of specify, right, you know, which one they're using, which one to mean. But like communism with a capital C, you know, as a thing that arose in like the late 19 teens, was an attempt to overcome capitalism, although it's one that people like a young Christopher Hitchens, as Trotskyist would point out, okay, so we've gotten rid of the sort of this class of private owners, but you know, that doesn't really mean we've empowered the working class, right? You know, like you just have a different ruling class, you know, who's over them in this system. That would be their critique. And then there's another branch of it, you know, which is roughly became known as social democracy, which is the branch that I think the Nordic, you know, countries, you know, Norway, Sweden, Finland, Denmark, that, you know, when we think of them, we're thinking of these as places where social democratic parties had been in power for a long time, and obviously they did not, you know, institute a post-capitalist society in any way, right? You know, as say, like 90% of the means of production or whatever, probably lower with Norway because so much of the economy is the oil, which is nationalized. But but like in you know, but whatever, you know, the great bulk of the means of production is privately owned. But there are a lot of things that, you know, you could think of as sort of like dollops of socialism doled out, you know, within a basically capitalist framework that have been instituted, like, you know, socialized healthcare, for example, or, you know, daycare, or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? That these things that both make people less reliant on the market and also institute at least some form of social ownership in at least some, you know, some parts of the economy. And then somebody like Bernie Sanders, originally, like if you go back and look at like 1970s Bernie, you know, I think he's somebody who in some ways has politics that are not dissimilar to 1970s Christopher Hitchens, you know, that like as somebody who is, you know, who certainly rejects the sort of authoritarian state socialism of the Eastern Bloc, but but does have long-term political horizons that go beyond just social democracy, and but then I think, over the course of the decades of, being in this very lonely position of being the only socialist between, whatever, 1990, or what, to, whatever year the squad is elected, I guess that's 2000, 2018, right? The only socialist in U.S. Congress, as sort of gets more and more and more moderate until he's basically a Scandinavian social democrat with, maybe a little bit more of a little bit more edge to him in terms of like how he talks about politics and, taking on the millionaires, the billionaires and all that stuff. But in terms of his basic program, he's more or less like a Swedish social democrat.
And you have seen that shift in Latin American politics as well towards the left, and more recently with the last year's election of the left-wing Honduran president Xiomara Castro, thickly sort of like a continuation of a political shift in Latin America. We can even see this in Colombia, by the way, with Gustavo Petro, the left-leaning political candidate, is leading the polls. However, one of the big questions I have for you is that, can socialist policies really be successful, specifically in talking about Latin America, can they really be successful in places where corruption is still a major problem? So like giving the government a control of the means of production and resources, where bureaucracy and corruption are almost chronic.
Yeah, I mean, so I would say, okay, first of all, I'll put my cards on the table, yes. But more substantively, I think that, I don't want to minimize the concern, but I would also say that what I would maybe ask is to kind of like take a closer look at like exactly how the concern is supposed to work, right? So we talk about corruption. Well, what sorts of things we're talking about? And if we're talking about, for example, the idea that people get, preferential treatment, when it comes to state institutions because of bribery or nepotism or, things like that. What I would suggest is that there's something a little bit funny about saying that, well, because those things are bad, which they certainly are, therefore it's better for those institutions to just be privatized, right? Rather than be publicly owned. You say, well, okay, hold on. So certain people, we're worried that certain people are going to get like sort of preferential service because of, who they know or how much money or whatever they have, when in theory, everybody's supposed to get it equally, regardless of those factors. And so the solution is to get rid of the in theory commitment to everybody having them regardless of those factors and just openly sell them to the highest bidder. So people, so people could just buy ownership of them, and then the people who bought them could do whatever the hell they want with them, and distribute them however they like. I mean, that doesn't really make a lot of sense to me.
Fair enough.
So with Hitchens, you could say that no topic is off limits. And he went after political figures like the Clintons, Kissinger, Mother Theresa, and the church. How did he pick his targets? And what do you think was his biggest motivation?
Yeah. So I think that, certainly in the case of Kissinger, I think that part of what was going on there had to do with, he was very interested in Cyprus, going back to, I think his first wife was from there. He had he'd written a book about that, in like that was one of his first books, Hostage to History, and so I think he was really disturbed by the role of Kissinger, there. But also, I think by the time he wrote his Kissinger book, I think it might be a little bit of a function of the fact that he was actually like, in the introduction to that book, right? He's got this great passage where he's talking about how, he's talking about basically watching Henry Kissinger banter with people at a Vanity Fair party, and thinking that sort of, dumpy man with the stale jokes or whatever banter at the party, that can't possibly be the same man who ordered the assassinations and kidnappings and secret bombings, and no, it's the same guy, right? That they haven't. and so he's very so I think some of it is just he's kind of morally offended by the fact that in these worlds that he was swimming in, that of media, and Washington D.C. politics, as the Washington correspondent for the Nation for so long, working for Vanity Fair and all that, that in these worlds, and especially on the topics that he was most interested in talking about, right, which were not entirely but mostly foreign policy, that they have that Henry Kissinger was treated as this revered elder statesman when he knew that he'd committed like real atrocities, ranging from his involvement in orchestrating the overthrow of Salvador Allende's government in Chile in 1973 to the war crimes that were committed in Vietnam and Cambodia, to et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And this is a point that I think he really wanted to make. And I think that something, I think very roughly analogous might be going on in a couple of those other cases. That in the 90s, when he's running for the nation. I mean, now I think because we are in the United States in that era, in this era where the rise of Bernie Sanders and also I think Black Lives Matter and other things have like really shifted the way a lot of people think about the Clintons. But back in the 90s, I think a lot of people, even in sort of an environment like The Nation magazine, which has always occupied a little bit of a gray area between something more leftist and something more in the mainstream of American liberalism. Even there, I think a lot of people are very defensive, right, about the Clinton presidency, because the political war as it existed in the 90s, right, was like people defending Clinton versus Rush Limbaugh, Newt Gingrich, whoever, attacking them every day. And I think I think there's this kind of natural impulse to sort of rally around the thing being attacked by the people that you most hate, that I think afflicted a lot of his colleagues. And Hitchens, and again, I think Hitchens probably had a very similar reaction to that as he did to the Kissinger example. Like, come on, this is a guy who, Bill Clinton, who oversaw, so-called welfare reform, which what that looked like in practice is described in really grisly detail in Hitchens' Clinton book, No One Left to Lie To. This is a guy who in 1992, in order to prove that he was tough on crime, flew back to Arkansas during the 1992 election to personally oversee the execution of Billy Ray Rector, who was a profoundly mentally disabled, Black man who was, because of a head injury over the course of, his arrest and all that they have that to the point where, like, by some reports, he was asking for part of his last meal to be kept, for later, that he didn't understand what was happening to him. So, knowing all of this stuff about him, I think a lot of that, is also driving that decision. Even the third one, which is, okay, I think a lot of people in 2022, right, looking back on this, could say, okay, sure, Henry Kissinger, I understand, right, that makes sense. Bill Clinton, even that one, sure, right, fair enough. Mother Teresa, really? It's like, she's, her name even now is kind of a lazy synonym for, saintly self-sacrifice. And so it's like, why does he get Mother Teresa? And I think
and at the time it was pretty.
He does make some nice arguments in that book, but how did he come up with the topic? I said, okay, now I'm gonna trust Mother Teresa.
Yeah. No, well, I think that's exactly the thing, though. I think that I think that the sort of thread between those three targets, right, is precisely that, right? I mean, that like the fact that everybody, in the world seemingly, was so deferential to this person, and and all of that, when I think he had like, I'm sure by the time to write about her, right, that he realized there was a lot more to the story than that, and he was bothered by the fact that she was getting such a free pass, because she did seem like this wonderful saintly old woman who's helping desperate people, etc. When in fact, right, if you read that book, he makes a pretty good case, that they like there's there are one or two parts that might be a little bit of a stretch, but I mean, for the most part, right, in that book, he has, I think he's made his case. I think that she, in terms of her sort of relationship to politics within the church and politics in the wider world, and in terms of even some of her practices, at the hospices, right? So, and I think it is interesting, given that later in life, right, in the final years of his life, he was so focused on the religious issue, even though that wasn't a new view of his, right? I talked to his brother Peter Hitchens, who told me that he was pretty sure that militant atheism was the most consistent position that Christopher took, going back to he estimated about the age of 11, but so it was certainly a lifelong position that he held. But it wasn't one that he emphasized at all, really, until the last few years of his life. He'd write about it a little bit here and there, right? But even in a book entirely about Mother Teresa, that's not really an anti-religious book, or even really an anti-Catholic book. It's really very specifically focused on her, and for the most part, right, there's like one exception. There's like one passage where he's he's debunking this alleged miracle that happened at her house for the dying in Calcutta, and there's a little bit in there where he's talking about her alignment with the sort of most conservative faction of the Vatican on issues having to do with abortion and the ordination of women and contraception and et cetera, et cetera. But for the most part, right, he's much more concerned with issues like her lending her aura of moral credibility to the Duvalier regime in Haiti, which she was willing to closely associate with, and also the fact that she took all of this money allegedly for humanitarian. I mean, to be fair, I don't think she ever quite said, right, that it would be spent on that, but I think a lot of people assumed, right, that it would be spent. It would be spent on the care of sick and dying people in Calcutta. And it seems to have really been spent on missionary work. And in fact, I mean, she doesn't, she seems to have not really used, proper anesthetics, and, and to have had this kind of grisly view that, that suffering brings people closer to God. So, I mean, I think I think he's right, but I also do think if you look at all three of those cases, I mean, those three make up a sort of informal trilogy, but we could even include a fourth, which is the if you look at his commentary on Princess Diana and in the same time period, right, he did a documentary about her after she died, and he had he had a book way back in 1990, like this thin little book, kind of pamphlet called The Monarchy, a critique of British favorite fetish. And I think, so I do think there is an element there of, I want to say spite exactly, but like, I think there's an element of like being prone to being irritated when people who he thinks do not deserve to be valorized in the way that they are in most of the media, and wanted to push back against that.
Well, he did meet her, Mother Teresa, so I guess it didn't make a good impression on him.
Doesn't seem that way.
Now, Hitchens has become sort of a, I don't know, like a cult classic among progressive and younger generations. However, I mean, he passed. I barely see the name pop up on any articles or books anymore since his passing. What do you think was his biggest contribution as an author and as an intellectual to our society?
Yeah, and that is itself really interesting, right? Because I think, given just how prominent he was in like the last 10 years of his life, especially, it is kind of remarkable how much he's dropped off the radar, since then, right? That there was like, before mine, there was a book by Richard Seymour, who's somebody who shares a lot of the disagreements that I have with later Hitchens's foreign policy analysis, but has a much more sort of unreservedly negative view about that, called the trial of Christopher Hitchens, Unhitched: The Trial of Christopher Hitchens. And there's one, and there's a very strange book called by Larry Taunton, called the Faith of Christopher Hitchens, the Restless Soul of the World's Most Notorious Atheist. And that's kind of it, right? I mean, there are a couple more books coming out now because we just passed the 10-year anniversary of his passing, right? But I think there's been sort of remarkably little, which I suspect is a function of a couple of things. Which are one, that I think I think that so much of the later work was spent on militant atheism, and I think that because of some of the way that the culture war has changed since he died, I think that issue has, I mean, don't get me wrong, I think that's something humans will always find interesting, but I think but I think that issue has a lot less of a hold on the culture now than that it had in the late 2000s or even the 2010s. And then I also think that part of it is that so much of the, so he spent, let's say, take it from 1971, which is the first book, the year the first book that came out that has name on the cover, which was actually a collection of essays by Marx and Engels about the Paris Commune that he wrote an introduction to. Go from there to 2011 when he died. Well, for the first, a little bit of an oversimplification, because I think in the 90s, some of his views were already starting to shift and evolve in the direction they went. But for the first 30 years, he was writing from a very committed left-wing perspective. And then, to the extent that he's writing about politics in the last 10 years, he's very focused on supporting foreign policy positions that anybody who was a fan of the first 3/4 of the work, right, would have a big problem with, quite rightly so, in my view, right? So in some ways, I think that puts him in a little bit of a strange position now, because people who, I mean, he certainly still has a following among people who agreed with all the stuff in the last 10 years, all the post 9/11 positions, and still think he's completely right about all of that, right? I mean, there is definitely a contingent of people who are still out there who basically think he was just right on all fronts, right? That is completely correct, and those people don't like this book at all, right? But I also think there are a lot fewer of those people, relatively speaking, right? Because the wars that he supported in the Middle East in that period, and for reasons I explore in the book about how he got there, right, are were such a disaster, right? That I think that even sort of right-wing politics in America has evolved in a slightly different direction, partially because of how much of a disaster those were, right? So I think that I think he probably has sort of fewer advocates in that sphere because of that, and then everybody who would like the first, Hitchens, the first 30 years, right? The last 10 casts a pall on that, right? So there are a lot fewer people on the left who sort of want to kind of revive interest in Hitchens. So I think as surprising as it is on sort of first glance that somebody who wrote as beautifully as he did, who wrote sort of intelligently and searchingly on as many interesting topics as he did, who was as prominent in the media as he was in the last 10 years of his life, who has, I mean, if you're interested as I am in, public debates, I mean, he's probably the best practitioner of that, that in the era where that's been saved on YouTube, so despite all of that, right, I think it does kind of make sense when you think about that for those three reasons that he has, certainly not been forgotten. Everybody knows who he is, but I mean, he has really dropped off the radar. That you just don't see, you don't see references to him the way that you used to, which I think is a shame, because I think that even on the issues that he was wrong about, right? He's worth taking seriously and engaging with, in the way I try to do in the book, right? I mean, like, he's somebody who's going to give you, he's such a good writer, and he has such an interesting perspective that, even when he's completely wrong, right, he's going to give you the argument for the thing he's completely wrong about, that's going to make you think twice. Be like, well, is he wrong? I think he is, right? And I see a lot of value in that. I mean, I think that his best work, I guess, to directly answer your question, I think his best work is, to my mind, the books that we just finished talking about, right? Like I think all of those hold up really well, and a lot of the columns that he was writing for The Nation in the 80s and 90s. There are a couple of there's a collection called For the Sake of Argument, and another called Minority Reports, I believe. I think those are the two titles. That like sort of thick anthologies of that, and unfortunately those haven't really been brought out in like nice shiny new editions like so many of his other books have, possibly in part because there's so much that he writes in there that feels a little ironic, given where he ended up, in the last several years of his life, but I think those definitely reward rereading, and I even think that, I mean, this is in some ways the one I feel most ambivalent about, because I do have a critique of a lot of what he says about this stuff, which I give in the book, but I do think that all of the debates that he did about religion in the final years of his life, I think are worth watching. I think even though he's not he's not a philosopher, I think that when he gives, when he's sort of on ground where he's been asked to engage on kind of philosophical arguments for and against the existence of God, like he has this debate with William Lane Craig, I think he's very shaky on that ground. But nevertheless, I do think that because of those debates, he has such a wealth of kind of historical and literary knowledge that he brings to bear, and I also think there's a kind of humanistic moral critique of at least the Abrahamic religions, which is what he's really focused on, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, that I still find somewhat compelling. I mean, I think that he did probably articulate better than just about anyone else.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, he was an excellent debater, and even when he was wrong, you would still admire the way he would articulate his arguments. Ben, thank you very much for your time today. Since this is Books Over Drinks, we'd like to ask our guests which drink goes well with their books. I think we know that the Hitch likes Johnny Walker Black, but what is your poison?
Well, I was going to say, I mean, obviously, John, for this one, for this in particular, yeah, that is really the only answer that works for a book about Christopher Hitchens. He could be incredibly, funny and sort of eloquent about his love for her, right? And there's an interview where he's the interviewer is like collecting questions from the audience and then picking them to pass on, and he asks him two questions, which are one, what would he bring to a desert island, and the other one is his favorite kind of whiskey. And Hitchens said, well, those sound to me like the same question. The answer is Johnny Walker Black, which he then like sort of goes on to say some jokey things about how it's the favorite drink of the Iraqi Bath Party and this Saudi royal family, and etc. But all the groups that he liked the most, I actually think my graphic designer J. Andrew World even put a little bottle of it in the background and in the image of him on the front. I will say, I have had a good bit of Johnny Walker Black over the years, in part because it's the silly, it's what Christopher Hitchens drank, right? But when I am, but all else being equal, I'm I do like whiskey quite a bit, but I am more of a single malt guy. So this is so like it's books over drinks. So I poured a drink before us, and this is Ardbeg Wee Beastie, which is single malt Scotch.
Very nice.
Cheers.
Cheers.
All right. Well, the book is called Christopher Hitchens, What He Got Right, How He Went Wrong, and What He Still Matters. It is by Dr. Ben Burguis. Ben, it was a pleasure speaking with you today. Thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to having you back.
Of course. Thank you so much.
Caribe Radio, nos proponemos ser la emisora online calificada para ser la mejor opción en comunicación para usted. Nos preparamos en noticias, deportes, cultura, música y de entretenimiento general para que usted esté conectado todo el tiempo con nosotros. Caribe Radio ofrece el mejor servicio de comunicación digital para que las empresas se hagan visibles a diferentes públicos. Desde lo público trabajamos para el servicio y por el servicio social. Caribe Radio Online nos entrenamos día a día para brindar la mejor opción en producción de medios digitales. Caribe Radio, la radio del futuro.